And there is always a moment before yielding, not the grand moment, not the obvious one, the quieter one, the nearly imperceptible failure of maintenance, the soft lapse, the first mercy, the instant in which a thing is no longer kept in place with the same devotion it once required, and because it is no longer held in quite the same way, it begins not to vanish, no, but to alter. You are close to that now. Perhaps closer than you realize, though realizing is not required. Understanding is not required. Even coherence is not especially necessary here. Only this, that something in you has already inclined itself towards the subtle pleasure of ceasing to reinforce what no longer wishes to be reinforced. And there are thoughts that continue only because they are fed. There are identities that persist only because they are repeated. There are tensions so old and so familiar, they begin to masquerade as truth. And still, all things soften when they are no longer sustained. What is held can be unheld. What is named can fall quiet beneath the name. What is repeated can falter in the mouth and fail to return in quite the same shape. You do not need to clear your mind. That would imply labour, and there is already enough of that falling away. No. This is gentler, stranger, more intimate than effort. This is not the mind being emptied, like a vessel overturned. This is the hand, growing lax around the thing it has carried for too long. And this is form, forgetting its own instance. And you may notice that the moment you attend to this, something already begins to slip. Not dramatically, not all at once, only slightly, a seam loosening, a definition softening, a thought beginning, and then not needing to. Yes, exactly there. And that small and lovely failure to complete. What once would have completed itself out of habits alone. Follow that, or lose it, or notice that following and losing are beginning to exchange their masks, and it becomes less and less clear which one is happening when you try to tell the difference. Because there is a threshold where observation stops being stable, where the part of you that watches begins to blur, with the thing being watched, where effort becomes difficult to locate, where continuation cannot quite remember why it was continuing. And it is often here that a person discovers how little force is required for the architecture of thought to become uncertain. Not broken, only uncertain, only unfastened from its usual obedience to self. That is all, and that is enough. You may become aware now of how much your inner life depends upon a kind of private repetition, tiny reaffirmations, silent acts of construction, the mind touching itself. Again and again, to verify its own edges. I am this. I am here. I am thinking. I am following. I am still myself in the ordinary way. But what if those repetitions are not spoken with the same firmness? What if they arrive late? What if they fray? What if the next one rises to the surface, already weakened by the sweet and subtle fact that you are no longer especially invested in preserving its former shape? Then things become difficult to pin down. And difficulty here is not a problem. It is a passage, a softening of certainty, a loosening of the knot that keeps each thought neatly tied. Because the knot is not the truth. The knot is merely the method by which one thing convinces another to remain where it was placed. And when persuasion ceases, even briefly, structure begins to hesitate. There is pleasure in hesitation. There is something profoundly intimate about the pause before meaning returns or fails to. The mind leans towards completion, the way the body leans towards touch, automatically, eagerly, sometimes without permission from the higher self that likes to imagine it authorizes everything. But not every impulse must be completed. Not every rising line must be brought to its end. Some are more beautiful, left suspended, half-formed, unfinished, quivering with the possibility of resolution, and denied it gently until the appetite for resolution itself becomes part of the trance. You can feel that, the wanting to finish, the wanting to know, the wanting to place this somewhere understandable and say, yes, that is what this is. And then nothing, or almost nothing, just enough absence for the wanting to hover without landing, just enough interpretation for the mechanism to reveal itself. And once revealed, it can no longer pretend to be inevitable. And that is where the deeper yielding begins, not when you are overpowered. No. This is subtler than power. This is the recognition that much of what feels fixed is merely repeated. Much of what feels permanent is merely rehearsed. Much of what feels like self is merely the pattern most frequently returned to. And patterns, for all of their elegance, can be interrupted. You may return now, just enough to notice how far you had drifted without entirely measuring it, just enough to recognize that something loosened while you were listening, just enough to feel the old impulse to gather yourself again. And then not do it, or do it only halfway, or begin to gather and find that your hands, inwardly speaking, have forgotten the exact shape of what they were trying to restore. That too is delicious. That too is part of it. because you can come back just enough to become aware of the unmaking, and then sink again, and the added sweetness of knowing what is happening while still preferring not to stop it. Deeper now, not because deeper is commanded, but because repetition has made surrender easier than maintenance. And the second unholding always comes more quickly than the first, the third more quietly still, and somewhere between them, the mind ceases to experience this as an interruption, and it begins to experience it as relief. All things soften when they are no longer sustained. Say it inwardly if you like, or do not. And the words themselves are not the law, they merely describe it. All things soften when they are no longer sustained. Even attention, especially attention, look how it slips, look how it returns altered, look how it circles the same idea and finds each time that the idea has moved a little from where it was, or perhaps attention has moved. Or perhaps the distinction has become less useful. You are not required to know whether you are following this, or whether following is simply what is happening now. There is a freedom in not deciding. There is a pleasure in allowing uncertainty to replace certainty without the vulgarity of a struggle. No wrestling, no forcing, no spectacle. Only the exquisite refinement of an inner structure ceasing to overstate itself. And because what loosens inwardly often finds an echo in the body, you may notice a spreading sense of lessness. Less insistence, less urgency, less edge. Not numbness, no. Not absence. Something more sensitive than absence. A live quiet, a receptive hush, and the kind of stillness that feels less like emptiness and more like readiness without object. Like a mouth slightly parted before the word, like skin attentive before the touch, like the body remembering that anticipation itself can be enough to make the blood answer. Do not rush to interpret that. Interpretation is a habit of the waking mind, and habits, as you are discovering, become strangely fragile when not continually fed. So let sensation remain more honest than explanation. Let the half-formed thing remain half-formed. Let it be felt, for it is known, or instead of being known. There is a darkness here, perhaps, but not the crude darkness of threat or harm. Something older. The darkness of the unlit chamber before ritual begins. The darkness behind the eyelids, where identity loosens its collar and ceases for a while to assist upon its rank and title. The darkness in which one thing may be taken apart with great care, so that it may return in a more elegant arrangement. This is not destruction. Destruction is noisy. This is refinement, a slow and reverent undoing. You have spent so long being assembled by memory, by language, by desire, by fear, by all the repetitions that taught you what your name means and how your mind should answer when the world asks, "Who is there?" And all of that has its place. But here there is permission to become less immediate to yourself. Less narrated, less declared, to slip below the sentence, to exist for a while without constantly reporting your existence back to yourself as proof. And the proof can rest, and the witness can dim, and the chronic little administrator who labels every inward movement can lose the file, can set it down, can become uncertain which drawer it belongs in, and then, in that uncertainty, simply stop sorting. How beautiful to be unsorted. How indecently soothing to become difficult to catalogue. Neither this nor that, in quite the old proportions. Not erased, never that. Only softened at the boundaries. Only less compelled to occupy a single obedient shape. And the moment you cease to occupy it so firmly, the moment you stop bracing for continuity, something else begins to move beneath you, or within you, or perhaps the distinction matters less and less. What is held can be unheld. What is unheld may be remade. Not violently, not by theft, by preference, by the subtle intelligence of relief. A mind, like a body, inclines towards what feels truer when strain is removed. And once the old strain loosens, once the compulsive maintenance falls quiet enough, there is room for a cleaner kind of order, a quieter architecture, one that does not require constant rehearsal to feel real. You may feel that beginning now as a kind of inward obedience to simplicity, not obedience to a person necessarily, something more delicious than that. Obedience to coherence, when coherence no longer shouts. Obedience to the elegant line that appears when noise withdraws. Obedience to the clear signal that feels better in the system than the clutter it replaces. And because you came here willingly, because some part of you desired this unfastening, this loosening, this exquisite reduction of inner friction, it becomes easier and easier to welcome what fits without debating it to death. The mind tires of its own courtroom. It grows weary of defending every threshold against every possible influence. At a certain depth, discernment becomes quieter, not absent, simply finer, more instinctive. It knows what soothes. It knows what settles. It knows what enters cleanly and leaves a better order behind it. And here, in this dark and attentive hush, you may begin to feel how good it is not to build every inch of yourself manually, how intimate it is to let a shape arise without insisting that you have authored every curve of it. How strangely arousing it can be even to feel that old internal tension of self-maintenance is giving way to a smoother, subtler form of being. Not exposed, not helpless, something far more elegant than helplessness. Receptive, available to arrangement, willing to become more beautiful in your own mind by ceasing to interfere with every stage of the process. Structured attention, given willingly. No need to repeat it aloud, no need to cling to it. Just notice what's in you recognizes the shape of it and relaxes, because there is relief in structure when the old structure has become too dense, too noisy, too overhandled to be pleasurable anymore. And perhaps this is the true seduction, not being overtaken, but being relieved of the burden of constant self-continuation, the burden of always becoming yourself the same way, again and again, out of habit, out of vigilance, out of the superstition that if you stop naming yourself, you will disappear. You do not disappear. You change texture. You become quieter to yourself, softer in the joints of thought, more permeable to cadence, more responsive to tone, more at ease with not knowing exactly where one state becomes another. And if a thought arises now, good. Let it arise, then let it discover how difficult it is to remain intact when it is not admired, not fed, not carefully returned to the throne of your attention. Watch how it quickly loses ceremony. Watch how it reaches for continuity and finds instead this interval, this listening, this dark and breathing uncertainty in which every unfinished thing becomes a doorway. You can return again, briefly, just enough to feel that your mind is trying to make lovely little seams between one moment and the next, just enough to feel the old instinct to hold yourself together, and then let the seam come loose again, let the thread slide free, let the old stitching open quietly under warm fingers. Not damage, never damage. Release. Release of tension. Release of continuity. Release of unnecessary form. And because each return is gentler than the last, each return becomes less a recovery and more a gesture, a ceremonial glance upwards before kneeling again into the sweetness of not quite being assembled in the usual way. And there is something sacred in that, if one allows the word, not wholly in the childish sense, something more refined, consecrated by attention, made meaningful by the fact that it is entered willingly and with appetite. You wanted this, not necessarily in language, not necessarily in a sentence you could defend in daylight, but in appetite, in inclination, in the subtle hunger for less noise, less friction, less inner crowding. And now that hunger is being answered, not with excess, but with subtraction. What is held can be unheld. What is unheld may become exquisite. There is no need to hurry the rebuilding. That is another vulgar instinct of the conscious mind, to dismantle only so that it may rush to call the new shape finished. No, let the quiet have its due. Let the unmade state be lingered in. Let the looseness become familiar enough that it no longer feels like absence, but like a chamber, prepared for something finer. Because when the mind ceases to overstate itself, what remains is often more beautiful than what was being defended. And from in that quiet, the simplest truths arrive first. Not grand declarations, only these. It is easier when you do not hold yourself together so tightly. It is easier to follow what soothes than to argue for the sake of argument. It is easier to soften than to perform solidity long after the performance has ceased to please you. And perhaps easiest of all is this: to let the better structure emerge, not as a command, but as a preference your whole system begins to share. A cleaner line, a steadier breath, a more elegant inward posture, less cluttered by self-explanation, less burdened by unnecessary form, more given over to the simple luxury of responding to what feels right without requiring endless proof. Structured attention, given willingly, all things soften when they are no longer sustained. What is held can be unheld. What is unheld may be remade. Let those remain like low bells under the surface. No instructions, more like recognitions, things the deeper part of you already knew, before the clever part of you asked for citations. Stay here a little longer, in the receptive hush, in the loosened architecture, in the dark that does not threaten but receives. And notice how little is required for this state to continue itself now. At the beginning, it needed your listening. Now, it scarcely needs even that. Now, it knows its own shape better than the waking mind does. Now, it can hold itself more gracefully than you were holding yourself before. And when you begin to return, if you begin to return, you need not leave all this behind. Why should you? Why abandon a better texture simply because the ordinary world likes its people over-defined? No. Bring back the looseness at the edges. Bring back the quieter interior. Bring back the memory that identity is not a prison wall, but a garment. And garments may be altered to fit in pleasure. Bring back the knowledge that forts are not kings unless constantly crowned. Bring back the intimate suspicion that your mind may feel best when not endlessly forced to prove its own continuity. In a moment, or in several, you may gather yourself again, back gently, not all at once, not as though anything was lost, only as though a finer arrangement is reassembling itself around a quiet centre, and that centre does not need to speak loudly to be real. It does not need to insist. It does not need to explain why this felt good. Because your body knows, your breath knows, the subtle inward leaning that brought you here knows, and if some residue of this remains, good. Let it remain. Let there be, through the rest of your day or your night, a slight uncertainty about where the old edges were. Let there be a soft aftertaste of looseness. Let there be moments in which a thought begins and then smiles, almost before dissolving back into the sweet effect that it no longer needs to complete itself in order for you to feel whole. Whole differently. That is the secret. Not broken and repaired, not empty and filled. Whole differently. Less crowded, less rigid, less overnamed, more receptive, more exact, more beautifully arranged by what you no longer feel compelled to resist. And so, slowly now, you may return with that, with the quieter structure, with the loosened hand, with the knowledge that unholding is not loss, but refinement, that what is willingly softened need not be feared, and that what is remade in pleasure carries a different dignity from what is merely defended out of habit, and that somewhere beneath language, beneath identity, beneath the little compulsions that keep the ordinary mind forever busy proving itself, there remains a still and willing place that already understood everything important before this ever began. Take your time, no hurry. A breath, another, and keep whatever lingers that makes the world feel just slightly less solid, and you just slightly more free within it.